Right, Joe Morgan, what is your fifth and final tip?
Right, tip number 5. Don't forget the respond part of responsive teaching.
Whoa, catchy. That's the kind of clickbait headline I'm looking for there. That's good. Right, go on, tell me about this.
Right, well, what used to be called assessment for learning and now more commonly called responsive teaching, it comes up a lot in lesson observations. So quite often when you're observed, or if I go and observe someone, one of the things that often people are writing on these lesson observation forms is, could be more AFL, how are you assessing what the students know? So, but when we're talking about that, we're often talking about how the assessment takes place. So we might be talking about, are you using mini whiteboards? Are you using questioning effectively? Are you using, I don't know, exit tickets or diagnostic questions? You know, if they've got iPads, you get them to do some diagnostic questions at the end before they leave, or are you circulating and looking over their shoulders? So there's all these different techniques for assessing. But I tend to find that when people are giving feedback on their lessons, the focus is on, did you do the assessment rather than how did you respond to the assessment that you did? And that's the hard bit, and that's the bit that actually I think a lot of people don't know how to do. So when you see them get something wrong, how do you then on the fly adapt your lesson or adapt your next lesson to respond to it? And I don't think it's happening. I don't think it's people are adapting their lessons as they should do, for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's you have to be able to think on your feet and think very quickly. If you see a big misconception in a lesson, or you see that you've explained something and no one's got a clue what you're talking about, you have to think very quickly to think, you know, what's the other way I can explain it? What different examples can I use? How should I respond to the fact that half the class have got it and half the class have no idea? So that's sort of in the lesson. But the other thing is, there's this kind of fashion at the moment we're all talking about why are we all writing our own lessons? Why aren't we using centrally planned lessons? And there's like quite a thing at the moment. And I've heard, I went to a talk recently with the NECTM, where they were saying, you know, how silly that all these teachers plan their own lessons on their own. What a terrible use of time. And there are parts of that argument I strongly agree with, but also, if we're going to use a centrally planned bank of lessons where a whole unit of teaching has been planned in advance, lesson by lesson, that doesn't really give us the opportunity to respond to our students.
Yes.
And I tweeted about this recently, about how I did a lesson on scattergraphs with Year 8. And I've got a pretty smart class of Year 8s. They're really good. I can rely on them to be good at whatever I give them. Yeah, they're a good class. And they had done scattergraphs in science. And I knew they'd done scattergraphs in science because I had asked them in advance, and also I had checked with the science teachers. And yet, because I was short on time, because maths teachers are always short on time, like I was rushing topics because I spent a long time going to depth on one topic, and it left me very little time for scattergraphs. I thought I'm going to do it in 2 lessons. I'm going to do one on correlation, and I'm going to do one line of best fit, because I've done it before. And of course, what happened was, in that very first lesson, they got the correlation thing, no problem, and then I gave them a task. Well, I wasn't really testing their knowledge of correlation, because the task said, plot a scattergraph and then write down what the correlation is. So really the task was testing whether they can plot a scattergraph primarily, and they just couldn't. Like, their scales were out of control, crazy, awful stuff. Like, they had no clue how to draw a graph, an axis. And the thing is that I hadn't taught them that, I hadn't modelled it, so immediately I thought, well, that's my mistake. I should have assessed up front, or I should have checked before I got started whether they could do this particular skill, because basically I've just made a mess of this. So what I did was I scrapped my next lesson plan, which I was going to do line of best fit. I hadn't planned it yet, though, because I don't plan lessons a long way in advance, because I know that that's a silly thing to do. So that's fine, I hadn't planned it. So I then went that evening and I planned the next day's lesson, where I taught them about scale, and we looked at some scales with mistakes, and we talked about why those scales were wrong, and we talked about how to draw axes, and we practiced that. And then by the end of that lesson, they were doing axes and scattergraphs much better. So I fixed the problem. Because I was responsive to what I saw in the lesson. Now, if I was teaching a very regimented, pre-planned series of lessons, then I wouldn't have been able to do that, unless, of course, I had, I was kind of allowed. I guess in some schools they might say, yes, we have these lessons that you have to use, but you are allowed to adapt and veer off them if you want to. So I suppose that would have been all right. But, you know, I feel like I have to defend myself in the school. sometimes as a member of a leadership team, I get by the other members of the leadership team, I get told off for why are you planning your lessons in the evening, or why are you planning your lessons in the afternoon? You've got other things that are more important to do. Why aren't you just using other people's lessons? Why aren't you sharing lessons in the department? Now, we do share stuff. I save my stuff in a shared area. Other people are welcome to use it. But the reason I'm planning my lessons the night before is because we have maths 4 days a week. So I'm not like other subjects where I have a nice 3-day gap between lessons. And I have to respond to what I saw that day. Like, you can't just ignore what you saw in today's lesson and just carry on regardless. You have to respond to it. So yeah. There are other examples where you don't have to, it's not about changing the next lesson. So for example, this week I was doing a lesson on transformations with year 10, and they were doing some practice on invariance. The whole lesson was about invariance, and then there was one question they got to on negative, which they had to do a negative enlargement and write about which points were invariant. And I had one hand went up, first person that got to that question, I can't remember how to do a negative enlargement, they did it in year 9, and then another hand went up, and by the time the third hand went up, I stopped them all, and I said, I'm just going to model a negative enlargement question because I can see that everyone's forgotten how to do this. Now, I don't like to interrupt people when they're working on a task, but that required me to adapt my lesson during the lesson because I was responding to what I saw. So basically, there's a couple of things here. One, I do see massively the advantages of off-the-shelf units of lessons that are planned in advance. I definitely see the advantages to teachers that need support and for efficiency. But we have to make sure that if we're doing that we are still allowing our teachers to be responsive to what they see in front of them and adapt those lessons massively if they need to, because being responsive is the right thing for our students. High quality lessons are important for our students, but being responsive is part of that high quality teaching, and you lose the being responsive if you've planned the whole thing in advance. And then the other part of that is learning techniques to be responsive in the lesson and knowing when it's the right time to say that I've got this plan and I was hoping to get to this point in this hour, but actually halfway through I've realised that I'm going to have to scrap the second half of the lesson and divert because of what I'm seeing in front of me. I think teachers have got really good at the assessment part of responsive teaching, but we need to do more work on the responsive part of responsive teaching.
Lovely that, Jo. Right, just a few things about this. I think there are kind of 3 kind of times in a lesson where I would do kind of what I call kind of formal formative assessment, and I think the first one's probably the key, that pre-req knowledge check. I spoke with Adam Boxer about this. If you get that bit right, you just save yourself a load of potential hassle going forward. And I think if teachers are going to be responsive anywhere, that's possibly the easiest part to be responsive, because you ask this question, the prereq knowledge isn't there, so you don't really have a choice. You have to stop and teach that prerequisite knowledge. I think it gets a bit more difficult when you start doing formative assessment midway through a lesson, when perhaps the kids are practicing a new concept that you've taught them. It's quite tempting just to kind of let them kind of crack on with it and keep practicing, but then if you stop them there and just do a bit of a sense check of where all the class are, either with diagnostic questions or mini whiteboards or whatever, it's then sometimes quite difficult to respond there, because sometimes it's, all right, the rest of you crack on with this, whereas the ones who are struggling just watch me at the board or kind of come around in a small group. But it's so important to do.
Yeah.
And then that final part, as you say, whether it's an exit ticket or a final question at the end, that's quite nice, because then, as you say, you then have a bit of time before the next lesson to think, and it might not be scrapping the whole lesson, it might be saying, right, for the first 10 minutes, I'm just going to need to go back over this, and so on and so forth. Second thing was, I've definitely been there with this. Certainly when I was much less experienced, your lesson plan, it's almost like it's set in stone. So I'm going to use this slide, then I'm going to use this slide, and so on and so forth. I'd never put the 2 and 2 together, though, Jo, to start thinking about the pre-prepared resources, which are really high quality, may actually cause teachers to be less responsive. It's a really interesting thing, that. And it goes back to that story I was talking about previously, where this guy was clicking through the PowerPoints. There was no way he was going to do anything apart from click next slide. There was no way he was going to be able to respond, because then what's he going to do? He's going to have to close his PowerPoint down, get up on the other. It just wasn't going to happen. So that's really interesting. That I'm a big proponent of these shared resources for workload and also kind of lesson sequencing reasons. But yeah, I'd never put 2 and 2 together. That's really nice, that, Jo. I like that. And my final thing, and I'm obviously ridiculously biased, but I think diagnostic questions are quite good for responsive teaching for 2 reasons. So, well, three reasons. So one, they're very quick to kind of ask and get the whole kids. You get a response off all the kids, whether it's A, B, C, D cards or mini whiteboards or whatever. Two, if the kids get it wrong, you have a sense of why they're getting it wrong because of their choice of wrong answer. So each wrong answer will give you an insight into the specific nature of their misunderstanding. So you can then you've got, if you've looked at the question in advance and you think, okay, loads of my kids are going for A's wrong and I know why because I've looked at the question before, you're then probably in a better position to have a good explanation or a demonstration or whatever. But finally, I think the most challenging thing about responding in responsive teaching, as you've said, is how you actually respond. If you've got half your kids who know what they're doing and half your kids who don't, that's potentially difficult. But with diagnostic questions, what I tend to do is the kids who don't know what they're doing, I've got an insight as to why, so I can support them. But the kids who do know what they're doing, I can simply say something like, well, one of my favourite things to say to the kids is, for a diagnostic question, can you write me three more questions which would make each of the wrong answers right? So I can give this, like, okay, we know D's the right answer to this question. Whilst I'm helping out the rest of the class, can you write me a question as similar to the one that we've just seen here? So just change one thing, but make A the right answer. Then change one thing and make B the right answer. And that means that I don't have to give out another worksheet, another activity or anything like that. They can be busy in a useful way whilst I can help the other kids out. Because to take you right at the point you made right at the start, the reason I think teachers struggle with the responsive bit of responsive teaching is that is the hard bit. That's the hard bit. And it's a lot easier when all the kids either know it or all the kids don't know it. But when you have this split, it's quite difficult to respond. So that's some of the kind of things that I would do. Did you have any thoughts, if you get that position, Joe, where you have a bit of a split in the class of knowledge? It's tricky, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right, because you've got this thing where if the whole class is useless at something, then you either change that lesson or you change the next lesson, and you just have to teach that thing they all can't do. But yeah, and if it's one or two students, then that's easier because you can just go to them directly. But you're right, if you've got half the class getting it and half the class not, that is really challenging. So like you say, you need to find something that's going to get the ones who get it doing some reasoning while you're still explaining or adapting your explanation for the ones who don't get it. Because that's the thing, isn't it? It's about adapting your explanation. Like if you've shown them a way of doing it, if you've modelled a number of examples and they're still not getting it, you need to model them differently, or you need to find a different explanation, or you need to find a different method. And so it takes quite a lot of experience and expertise to get it right. It's definitely the hardest bit of teaching.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because you think about in other subjects and how, you could have where they want students to write a paragraph, and like they're going around seeing that some students are writing these amazing paragraphs and some students are just writing a load of nonsense. And I can imagine it's just as hard there to sort of decide, if there's too many students to help individually, then what are you going to do then? And you really need to minimise the amount of times you stop a class and interrupt them, particularly for those who are getting on with it. Like, it's really hard if there's some who are just happily working away, to say, right, everyone, I can see some of you aren't getting this, so I want pens down and all eyes back on me. Because that's really frustrating for those who are fine with it. I don't have all the answers on the best way of doing it, but I do know that I really worry about this big trend at the moment for collaboration is a really good thing, and we should be collaborating and we should be being efficient. But these off-the-shelf lessons, they have to be used with caution, and it has to be really strongly emphasised that if you're using essentially, I'll say one tutoring department's going to plan all the angles lessons. I can see the advantages, but it also means that if you're delivering a series of lessons that someone else has taught, you need to have the confidence to not use that lesson halfway through the lesson if your class, depending on what your class say. Because otherwise, all the assessment for learning is just a waste of time. If you're just, if you're getting them to do stuff on many whiteboards, or you're circulating, or you're questioning, and then you're saying, oh, they haven't quite got this, but I need to click on to the next slide, then they might as well not have done it. So yeah, I do think it's really, really tough. I'll tell you one more example. I used my my year 9s this year. They've got a class of year 9s who struggle with maths, and they did a grid method last year for expanding double brackets. Early this year, I gave them a end of unit test on some topic, and I included some retrieval questions in that. And I could see that 3/4 of the class got the double bracket expansion wrong. They'd been taught the grid method last year. They made all the common misconceptions you get with that method, particularly that filling in the last box by adding the numbers. Like, that's really, really common. So then the responsive teaching for me there, from seeing that one test question that they all got wrong, was a couple of months later, when I did have the opportunity to do some algebra, because algebra came up on the scheme of work, I tried showing them a different method. So I said, look, you all taught how to do the grid method. I know that some of you have not remembered how to do the grid method. I'm going to show you a different way of doing it, and I used the distributive method, which was modelled very well by Chris Bolton at a recent maths conference, and I used his series of examples to model it, and it worked really well. And at the end of that series of lessons I did on that, I said, right, so in year 8 you were taught the grid method for expanding brackets. I've taught you a different method, which basically just requires expertise in single brackets to be successful in, which was really good for them because they had the expertise in single brackets. And I said, and I'll let you decide going forward which method you're going to use for this topic. But yeah, if I hadn't spotted that a lot of the class had not coped well with the method they've been taught in year 8, then I wouldn't have adapted my lessons for year 9. So I do think this responsive teaching thing, it can be short term, like in the lesson, or it can be kind of one lesson to the other, or it can even be like over a long period of time, looking at how they did in end of year assessment, or how they do in an end of unit test, and then thinking about how you're going to do things differently next time. So there's a whole load of responsive teaching that we all need to be thinking about, and I think it's a massively important part of what we do. And yeah, I think sometimes, like I say, in lesson observations, the emphasis is on how are you assessing, not how are you responding. So yeah, we do need to, I think as a profession, we need to get better at thinking about the best ways to respond.